Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So, what happened on Friday in the Oval Office is probably, I think, without parallel. And some people have said, this is often what happens behind closed doors. And so we actually just saw what happens behind closed doors for the first time. But to see it live on TV and going on for what was it, 45 minutes, where I think we had the president of the United States, the vice president of the United States, bullying I thought, an ally, and effectively threatening him or encouraging him, maybe I could use those, saying he's got no cards and telling them that he's got to accept whatever they negotiate directly with Putin was shocking. And so I wanted to discuss that in greater detail. My guest tonight is Peter Biro. He is the founder and president of a democracy think tank called Section 1. He's a senior fellow of Massey College. He's chair emeritus and past chair of the Jane Goodall Institute. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto at the Faculty of Law, where he teaches constitutional law. He is a lawyer, he's an educator, he's a writer, he's a democracy and civil liberties advocate and scholar. And he's someone who I think is very knowledgeable and very passionate about this issue. So, Peter, I think it was a travesty what happened. I think it's akin to Chamberlain giving up in 1938. How do you see it?
I see it as worse than what Chamberlain did, because ostensibly, and there's some revisionist history on the Chamberlain story that's been written lately, putting Chamberlain in a somewhat more sympathetic light. That is, that at least his intentions, it is said by some historians, weren't quite as dastardly as, no question, it was a policy of appeasement, and that was the problem. But it was appeasement with a view to achieving some kind of a peace, not to a concession that the fascist aspirations and the expansionist aspirations of Hitler were being acceded to. On Friday was a true day of infamy that in some respects surpasses the infamy of Japan's assault on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It was not simply a question of a great power belittling an ally. In fact, it was the great power who is no longer the ally. I think what's significant about what occurred in the Oval Office is that it was the moment in which America's withdrawal as leader of the free world and as leader of the Western Alliance was formally declared. He is now aligned not just with Putin, but with values, core values that are absolutely antagonistic to the presumed and stated interests of the West in the post-war period. So, a lot of people are looking at what's going on and saying, well, this is kind of Trump's effort to join Putin in a return to geopolitics in the time of the Cold War. It is partly that, but it's much worse than that, because even during the Cold War, America was committed to liberal international principles and was the strong leader of the West. The one thing that one can say about all of the differences that Americans had amongst themselves from the Second World War right up until the Trump era was that they agreed on certain core things. One of them was that they supported liberal democracy, liberal constitutional democracy. They understood that the Soviet Union and then Putin's mafia state were antithetical to what liberal internationalism called for. And they agreed that NATO existed for the purpose of defending the integrity of those liberal international principles and the sovereignty of free Western states. All of that has been thrown into the dustbin. By the way, you mentioned that we got a glimpse perhaps of what goes on behind closed doors, and on Friday we saw something out in the open. I surmise that what happened on Friday before the cameras has never happened behind closed doors. It's not that there aren't heated and sometimes ugly exchanges amongst leaders, both allies and foes alike. But what happened on Friday was a declaration of war. It was a betrayal of the core commitment that America and the West has had and has demonstrated over the past number of decades. That is now over. So this is much, much worse than a belittling of a true hero, Zelensky, by a true insurrectionist, and dastardly fascist. There's no question about that. The true patriot in the room were not those two American executives. It was Zelensky who was the true patriot. By the way, not just to the cause and mission of freedom and sovereignty for Ukrainians, but to the cause and mission of freedom, sovereignty, and liberal internationalism for the entire world, and certainly for the Western world. That was Zelensky on Friday.
Zelensky tried to get that final point that you're referencing out about, and I can't remember exactly how he said it, but you'll be a lot worse off, or you'll be in a worse position. And while Trump and JD Vance, the vice president, had spent, well, a whole bunch of time talking about him not thanking often enough, which was, I thought, absurd, but talking about, the negative situation that Ukraine was in, they didn't give Zelensky a chance to talk about what capitulation, what abdication, what appeasement might mean for the Western world, for NATO, for the United States, for the world longer term. And Trump's response retort was, "Don't tell me what bad position we'll be in, what poor position we'll be in." What do you think of that?
That you've honed in on a very, very important moment in that transaction in the Oval Office. Don't tell us what we will feel. We will feel just fine. We will be completely secure. This is a key example of sort of the Dunning-Kruger effect on steroids. The effect where, people are so incompetent that they don't appreciate their own level of incompetence, and don't understand that they're actually not up to the task. So they actually are so incompetent that they don't understand. They think that they understand something much better than they actually do, with dire consequences. The failure of Trump to understand what Zelensky was saying in that moment, that you will feel it here too, across the pond. The failure to listen and to be humble in that critical moment is going to prove, if not fatal, absolutely devastating for America down the road. The consequences of what Trump is doing. And by the way, Zelensky wasn't only saying you will feel threatened, you will feel, the wrath of Putin, or the consequences of Putin's aggrandizement and expansionism, and predatory disposition. He was also actually saying something more subtle and something much more important. You, America, will feel the consequences of your withdrawal from your steadfast leadership position on the side of freedom and democracy and sovereignty. That's what's critical here. What people don't appreciate, and I'm going to be talking about this at a conference that I'm convening at Massey College on April 15th, called Liberal Democracy in the Rear View Mirror, that it will take a lot more than the next election that may put a Democrat committed to those liberal internationalist principles back in the White House or back in charge of Congress. It'll take much more than a reversal of the election, or a series of elections, to restore America's security and position in the world. The damage that Trump did on Friday, and has been doing for some time, is quite extraordinary, because one of the things that is going to result from all of this, and we see this right now in London, where the European nations, along with Canada, are meeting to come up with a European solution, a European-led solution to the Russia-Ukraine war. That's really the beginning of a new alliance, and a recognition amongst those nations that they are going to have to step up and provide for their own defense and security and for the defense and security of the free world. So the free world is now looking for a new leader because it is no longer America, and it is certainly no longer the president of the United States. If there is a leader of the free world at this particular moment, it is Zelensky, who is really the true heir of Churchill. He won't likely be around as leader of Ukraine for that much longer. He may be, but it's quite possible that he won't be, because it may be that as part of the solution, a part of the proposed resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war and of security guarantees for Ukraine, particularly on the part of Europe, which have to be backstopped by the United States in some way or other. It may be that Zelensky will have to resign, and he's said that he's prepared to do that, which is really the mark of true leadership.
So you've touched on where I wanted to go in regards to the analogy with Munich, and that is that the only person that really stood up for what was right at the time, in my mind, and the fear that this appeasement wouldn't work was Winston Churchill. But for a full year, Chamberlain looked like he was right, and the politics, both in the UK as well as in the United States, were supportive of Chamberlain's appeasement and peace with Nazi Germany. And there were some rumblings and some rumors comparable to, I guess, what happened before Russia invaded Ukraine. That yes, the Nazis are arming and they're increasing their spending, and they may be even collecting tanks. But when they attacked Poland, the appeasement from a year earlier was proven to be completely wrong. And the only person that stood up, and he stood up within 3 days of that Munich conference, was Winston Churchill, and said this will go down in history as one of the worst diplomatic agreements ever entered into. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, who's the Winston Churchill today? And you're saying it's Zelensky, but Zelensky may not be there. Don't we need somebody that is the little boy that says the emperor has no clothes? And who is that today, if anybody?
Well, let me just, before trying to answer that question, and my guess on that is no better than anyone else's, but let's just go back for a moment to Churchill. I agree with the premise of your question and your comment. I think it's really important to focus on Churchill in particular at this moment. By the way, just in terms of the analogy, with the appeasement of Hitler, let's just remember that Trump and Putin together are kind of on the Hitler side of that analogy, right? So the question of, so to the extent that one might want to paint Trump himself as an appeaser, he certainly is the appeaser of Putin. But if we look at Trump being allied with Putin, which he clearly appears to be, for reasons that probably he himself doesn't fully appreciate. But we can talk about that a little later, and that has more to do with his personal psychology, his ignorance, his incompetence, and the transactional nature. I want to go back to Churchill. 1941, August 1941, one of the most important international meetings of the 20th century, took place between Churchill and Roosevelt on a ship just off the coast of Newfoundland that produced what came to be known as the Atlantic Charter. And this was August 1941, a few months before the Day of Infamy, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And I just want to draw to your attention the commitments that were made by Churchill and Roosevelt on that day, and that ultimately gave rise, or kind of laid out a kind of rough template for what the UN Charter would eventually look like and what the general mission of the UN would be about. Remember, the war began in 1939. So this is August 41. Roosevelt and Churchill sit down and they agree that a post-war world will involve no territorial aggrandizement, No territorial changes made against the wishes of people, i.e., the principle of self-determination. Restoration of self-government to those deprived of it. Reduction of trade restrictions. Think of that in the era of protectionism and tariffs. Global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all. Freedom from fear and want. Freedom of the seas, abandonment of the use of force, and disarmament of aggressor nations. And among other things, that charter also called for the availability of natural resources necessary to supply and provide nation states around the world with their essential needs, regardless of whether those resources were situated in those countries. In other words, there was a recognition that the Earth's natural resources were to be made available for the purposes of humanity at large. Now, shortly thereafter, you've got the real day of infamy, the December 7th. You've got Roosevelt's famous speech about the day of infamy, and you have the United States formally entering the war, and the rest is history. But that Atlantic Charter signaled the beginning of a global order that came to the end, that came to its end this past Friday. This past Friday, the United States of America, through the words and utterances of its president and vice president, formally, clearly, unambiguously resiled from the commitments made and the principles, adherence to the principles and core values expressed in that Atlantic Charter. Wow. Now, to your question about
that's a great way to end that segment. We're going to take a break. I want everyone to give some thought to what Peter has just said. We're back in 2 minutes. What Peter is saying is Friday, the United States ended a world that has existed since 1941 and certainly since 1945, an agreement. And a lot of the tenets of that Atlantic Charter, he is saying, ended with what Donald Trump and J.D. Vance said to who he says is the current Winston Churchill in the world, Zelensky. We're going to have to give this some thought. We'll be back in 2 minutes, everybody. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Peter Biro. Our topic is what happened on Friday in the Oval Office in the United States between Donald Trump, the president, the vice president, J.D. Vance, and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. And Peter's got a extremely knowledgeable but negative perception of what happened. And he's saying effectively it's the end of liberal democracy, the world order, NATO, the Atlantic Charter that was agreed to between FDR and Churchill in 1941, etc. Peter, I want to ask you a couple other questions, if I could, before we come back to what could happen and who could help it happen positively. I ended up talking to a gentleman you might know, Marcus Kolga, of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute last week about this situation, and he told me I expressed the point of view that I thought the discussions that were going on between Putin and Trump were comparable to FDR and Stalin at Yalta after or near the end of World War II, carving up the world into sort of two spheres of influence. And he interrupted me and he said, Brian, it's worse than that. This is akin to Stalin and Hitler carving up Poland. Because think of it, that effectively what Trump is saying is, I'm going to give you, Putin, 20% of Ukraine, and I'm going to take 50% of the critical minerals, the resources of the balance. And we're going to not allow Ukraine to exist the way it had previously. This is akin to carving up Poland. What do you think of that analogy?
Oh, Marcus is completely right. And might I just add as an aside, Marcus is a good friend, and he's also a member of the Section 1 Advisory Board. And I listened and watched your discussion with him and thought it was excellent. So he's exactly right. It's worse than the way even he framed it. It's worse than just, these two powers carving up Poland. It's these two powers dividing up, global interests, right? But being on the same side of the ideological uh, universe. I mean, that never occurred. That has never occurred in history. Just it's quite extraordinary. You've got Putin and Trump who agree that people should be governed the same way, that people should submit to a kind of mafia-like system of governance. You have America in the throes, not just of democratic backsliding, but as you and I have discussed in a previous segment, the end of liberal constitutional democracy altogether in the United States, the dismantling of the administrative state and of the machinery, the accountability machinery of government altogether. So this isn't just about carving up territories and countries in the world. It's about these two powers being on the same side ideologically and politically. It's absolutely extraordinary. When you go back and look at the disagreements that American citizens have had with each other over the decades, all right? And there've been some strong disagreements we can go back to the Civil War, the ultimate disagreement, right? But then you can go forward and look at disagreements over Vietnam and over the civil rights movement. And there have been profound differences over nuclear security issues and ballistic missile treaties and different sort of very, very polarized positions on disarmament. The one disagreement that never existed, at least in a meaningful way, within the American polity, was a disagreement about which side America is on in the grand journey towards liberal democracy and the struggle of freedom against tyranny and oppression. The United States has now, as of Friday, in my judgment, officially, publicly resigned from that commitment. And for the first time in this last election that brought Trump to power for the second time, and it will be the case in the next election if there is another free election, and I assume there will be, Americans are going to be on different sides of where they stand and where the country should stand in the global order, in the international order. Are they on the side of tyranny and illiberalism, or are they on the side of free states and free citizens? That's the first time you're going to have such a contest, both internally, and we're seeing it, of course, as of Friday, we're seeing it on the international stage already. It's extraordinary. So I think that in some sense, Marcus Kolga's very correct and astute observation was an understatement.
So your discussion of U.S. politics and the situation, I think, is interesting. And I am not a student of American political history. You probably are 10 times, if not 100 times more than I. But there have been some analogies in the past where some people in the Republican Party stood up to Nixon, where some people stood up to McCarthyism, where, I think it was Charles Lindbergh was effectively agreeing with a lot of fascism and Nazism and Hitler, and people stood up to him. What I've not seen in the United States right now is anyone within the Republican Party arguing what you're arguing, standing up to Donald Trump. And in fact, I'm seeing the reverse in that, you probably saw the interview with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, on Friday night. It was a very good interview. It was quite a long and involved one, far unlike the typical U.S. media interviews that last about 2.5 minutes. But effectively, Marco Rubio, who I haven't agreed with, but I've had some respect for in the past, and actually thought that he would make a good Secretary of State, and I thought he was very supportive of Ukraine, was effectively saying we got no options. The best option I heard from a European leader was we'll fight on for another year, and then maybe we'll have a slightly better negotiation after a whole bunch of people have lost their lives and money has been spent. So is there anyone in the Republican Party today that could stand up to Donald Trump?
Well, anyone and everyone in the Republican Party could stand up to Donald Trump. They're just not willing to. It's the victory, the triumph of cravenness, of fear and cowardice. I mean, it's important to understand that to really grasp what's going on, one has to understand not just the policy issues and the political interests at stake. One has to really understand the social psychology at work. And it's much like the social psychology that was at work during that critical transition from the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich, where the elites thought they could appease this kind of out of control leader. This is just as he was about to make himself chancellor and then essentially do away with the Reichstag as any sort of free deliberative body. It was fear. It was cravenness. It was appeasement. And then by the time the control was consolidated in absolute terms in Hitler's hands, it was too late for anyone to do anything about it. That is occurring in the United States right now. So Republicans are terrified. By the way, Marco Rubio, in the interview you're referring to, actually said that Zelensky should apologize for his behavior in the White House that day. It's extraordinary what's happened. And that, I can tell you with almost complete certainty, is not what Marco Rubio really believes in his heart. He has been outspoken consistently throughout his career as a defender of everything that Trump opposes and seeks to destroy. So the only way you can understand Rubio's disposition and his representations, his utterances, as with the leaders, the Republican leaders of Congress, and by the way, the billionaire class that have all caved as well, is cravenness, is fear of the repercussions, fear of losing their economic interest, fear of losing power, fear of reputational harm, fear of all kinds of things, fear of reprisal in every possible form. That is the dominant sentiment. That's the dominant feeling coursing through the veins.
I think there's two other things
of Republicans.
I think there's two other things as well, and maybe you could address this. I think that it is, and I'm coming back to your analogy of what happened within those similar circles in Germany in the early 1930s. I was at a fascinating presentation at Harvard Business School 2 years ago from a professor who was talking about the similarities between what was going on in early 1930s and he actually read from letters to shareholders of big German companies, actually led by Jewish leaders, that were talking about how Hitler was the best thing for Germany, and that they were, number one, believing they could control him, and number two, believing that some of the things that he had said, and they actually were dealing with things that he had said in Mein Kampf, and saying this is comparable to what people are saying in the United States. So this is just him spouting off. This is just him trolling people. They didn't use those words, but it's extremism that will never come to pass. So I think there's two other things in regards to fear. They are thinking that they can control him. They thought they could control Hitler. These executives today are thinking they can control Trump. And they're not believing him at his word, at what he's written, what he said. They're believing that it's just trolling, it's extremism, it's just negotiating, they're not believing that he's actually going to do what he's saying.
So that is absolutely accurate. It's not a full account of what was going on. But But if you want to make the analogy with what's happening now, that was the attitude and the disposition and the underlying rationale for supporting Trump the first time around. All right, 2015, 2016. It is not the rationale now. There's nobody who seriously believes they can control Trump. The first time around, it was all about that. That's the reason why the Republicans said, well, we'll go with Trump. He's popular, and he's the only one who could probably win the nomination, which turned out to be the case. And we will put adults all around him. There will be adults in the room in all of these important positions. All right, chief of staff, cabinet secretaries, etc. This time around, it's pure fear. You can dress it up all you want. There's nobody who thinks they can control Trump. Not Bezos, not Zuckerberg. Musk does think he can control Trump, and to some degree, he's being vindicated right now. We'll have to see how that plays out. But one thing is clear. The fear is based on the fact that, among other things, it's not just Trump's wrath that they're afraid of. It's that over the period of the last 10 years, the American electorate has been conditioned to move in this direction, has been gaslighted by Trump and his acolytes, all right, and people like Bannon and others in that sort of, think tank, conditioned to believe that Trump is the only possible savior for the country, and that the dismantling of the administrative state is a necessary agenda in order to protect and advance the interests of that base, of Trump's base. All right. And so the political elites in Washington now aren't just afraid of Trump, they're afraid of the electorate itself. They recognize now that there is a mass movement in the country of people who have been conditioned to support and give their allegiance to this man more than to his agenda. In a lot of ways, they're almost indifferent to the agenda. There's so much ideological and policy incoherence in Trump's thinking that it's difficult to speak about a clear and rational agenda. Vance, on the other hand, is someone who actually is a pretty smart character and does have an ideological agenda, which for the time being is on all fours with Trump's. But there's a guy who actually understands the significance of what they are doing, what this administration is doing. In Trump's case, it's more complicated. But the fear is what is accounting for this unconditional allegiance to Trump. So your question, who will stand up? I mean, there is no Howard Baker, the one who back in the Watergate period said, what did the president know and when did he know it? And who refused to give Nixon a pass. Now, you referred earlier in your question or your comment, you mentioned Watergate, and you also mentioned those people who stood up to Nixon, and you also talked about the McCarthy era. One thing that's really important to understand is that even in those dark days of McCarthyism, even the bad guys agreed with the good guys on one thing, which is America has to be on the side of democracy. What was insane about the McCarthyists and dangerous was, of course, that they took anti-communism to a kind of fever pitch, akin to the Salem witch hunts of yore, where the question of, and this is very Trumpist in its kind of methodology, where you're either a patriot or you're an enemy of the state. So in that respect, the analogy with McCarthyism is a good one. We're in a time now where if you don't agree, if you don't adhere and adhere to the values and espouse the values of Trump, you are an enemy of the state. And look, the Associated Press is kicked out of the, of the press, of press access to White House briefings and to Trump press conferences.
Just because they won't call it the Gulf of America.
Because they won't call it the Gulf of America. So we're talking about that kind of McCarthyite attitude. But again, unlike the McCarthy period, the current administration is fundamentally anti-American in every possible way. He has carried out an insurrection against America, American government successfully, and is proceeding step by step to execute a coup against the Constitution itself, against the Constitution itself. So he's on all fours with the evil empire in Russia. That's the polar opposite of where things stood during the McCarthy period.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Peter Biro talking about what happened on Friday in the Oval Office and how he thinks, Peter thinks, I agree with him, that this is the end of American leadership of the liberal democratic world for the last 50 years. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Peter Biro tonight about what happened in the Oval Office on Friday, and is there someone anywhere in the world to stand up to Donald Trump? Peter, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, if I could, and get your response. Jagmeet Singh says that we should not invite Donald Trump, allow him to come to the G7. What do you think to that, sir?
Well, it's a silly proposition for a number. Practically, it's a silly proposition, and it's a bad idea. I think the way that you remove or ostracize Trump is not by prohibiting him from participating in international conferences. Right? Diplomacy should always, diplomacy should never be sacrificed. Should never be sacrificed. The question is, what do you say when you meet? The question should not be, do we meet him or do we not meet him? Do we allow him to on our soil to play a role? I mean, he is almost an enemy of our state. It is true. And he should be treated in that way, in the sense that there should be public recognition and acknowledgement that the positions he has taken are antagonistic to the principles that underlie Canadian sovereignty.
So Andrew Coyne,
that's true, but Singh's position is just silly.
Andrew Coyne, columnist on the Insiders on CBC, made the point last week that when Charles de Gaulle came to Montreal and said "Vive le Québec libre," he was ushered out of the country within a day or two. Donald Trump is calling for Canada to become the 51st state, and is not just saying it. He's actually saying that he'll use economic coercion to demand that. I want to compare, if I could, Denmark's response to the threats against Greenland to Britain's response to the threats against Canada. And the Prime Minister of Britain, the Great Britain, was in the Oval Office on Thursday, I think it was. What do you think of his lack of response, his lack of defense of Canada?
Sorry, you're talking about Starmer's lack of defense?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I was tremendously disappointed, and that looked like a moment of appeasement. Macron was pretty close to the same thing a couple of days before that. Going back to your example about, obviously very, very disappointed, and very disappointed that King Charles, extended this invitation for a state visit. I mean, that looks a lot like appeasement to me. It looks like, America, please don't get angry with us. We need you. Now,
so this is the King of Canada.
Yep.
The King of Canada, when he is threatening Canada, extending an opportunity for a state visit.
Yeah.
Should the Prime Minister of Canada, should the Parliament of Canada be saying something to our monarch,
Yes, that
this is inappropriate?
Absolutely. It's more than inappropriate. I mean, it's a betrayal of his duty. All right. If nothing else, the king is loyal to country. All right. Not just the subjects of the king, but the king must be loyal to country. And that was a profoundly disloyal act. But let's just go back for a moment to de Gaulle and Vive le Québec libre. All right. It wasn't quite the same thing as, what occurs when a G7 summit is convened anywhere. That was a visit that de Gaulle made. And he had been warned and asked beforehand, all right, don't cause trouble. Don't cause trouble in Quebec. We have a serious, nationalist, if not separatist threat right now. So there's a national unity crisis that's looming in Canada. Please don't come here and stir up trouble for us. I mean, that was a very mischievous thing for him to do. And it was an interference in Canada's domestic affairs at that time in a moment that was really, really troubling. So, yes, he was ushered out, and he should have been ushered out. And by the way, I happen to be a huge fan of de Gaulle, but that particular moment was really an inexcusable act of mischievousness. The G7 summit is an international council of all of what really needs to happen is Trump should come if he dares to, and he should be shamed and humiliated when he gets here, but he shouldn't be prevented or disinvited. There should be an open conversation. There should be no flattery and appeasement, no fealty, and no bootlicking. And the members of the G7 should stand together on this fundamental crisis, on this question
which they
of where the West stands.
At the UN, passing a resolution that the United States didn't agree with, right?
It was an outrage. That resolution was an outrage. Absolutely. It's extraordinary that at the United Nations, the United States sides with Russia
against all of its NATO
against
allies.
Ukraine, against the principles of democracy, against the principles of freedom, against the principles of sovereignty, stands with North Korea, stands with Russia,
Iran,
and the other countries that voted.
the axis of, I won't say it. Peter, go to Marco Rubio's comment. Is there another option?
Of course, there's another option. I mean, the one thing one can say about Biden is that he was on the right side of the issue with respect to Ukraine. He just didn't do nearly enough. That was the problem. He wasn't strong enough in supporting Ukraine, didn't give Ukraine everything Ukraine needed to defend itself. And there even could have been a stronger NATO response to Russia's incursion. I mean, there was always this very, very real and legitimate fear that if NATO really gets involved, Russia unleashes its nuclear arsenal. So, that's a legitimate issue. But the option was very, very clear. I mean, you got to be on the side of what's just and right. That's the option. Not telling a true hero and patriot and the real guardian of Europe's liberty and sovereignty in the moment that he doesn't have any cards to play, that he's out of options.
I thought that exchange and the analogy of a card game was just terrible.
It was vulgar, it was obscene, and it really disclosed and revealed and exposed Trump, as the not just the bully, but as the mob, as the mob boss that he really is.
Well, and that he think he's just playing a card game, and it's just a negotiation, and there's no stakes involved, like lives, like like liberal democracy, like freedom, like Ukraine. It's just a card game, and
it's all about the deal. He said we're not going to be able. It's going to be very hard to do a deal like this. as though there are any underlying values or principles that matter.
We got to take a break. We're going to come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. What a great conversation. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've been chatting with Peter Biro about what's gone on with Trump, Zelensky, the Oval Office, Ukraine, negotiations, etc. And we've been talking about whether there's a Winston Churchill out there that can oppose, and we haven't figured out who that is. You've suggested Zelensky might be the only person that is comparable to Winston Churchill today. I want to give you a different scenario, if I could. I went to one of the best musical theatrical performances I've been to for a while. It's called Just for One Day, the Live Aid musical at the Ed Mervich Theater. And it was about how Bob Geldof from the Boomtown Rats got the whole world together twice with Band-Aid and a song, and then with Live Aid, where he got every single major performer in the world, both in London as well as in the United States, to get together for a concert to change the world's attitudes toward famine in Ethiopia. And they had a little thing where he actually convinced Margaret Thatcher, as long as he kept it quiet, which it didn't keep quiet, to give the 15% VAT that she had taken out of every donation back into it. And he really did change people's attitude toward Ethiopia. Is there a Bob Geldof if there's not a Winston Churchill?
Yeah,
is there somebody in this world, a Meryl Streep, a Jane Fonda, is there somebody that could rally people, regular, ordinary people, to make Trump change his mind, to make the world change his mind, to influence those Republicans that you talked about a couple minutes ago, the electorate that is so convinced that something's gone wrong with their country, even though economically the economist says it's the best economy in the world, that they needed this fascist individual to take over. If there's not a Winston Churchill, is there a Bob Geldof?
Well, Bob Geldof, if you were to speak to him today, might say that the transformation he had hoped for ultimately didn't really occur, or it wasn't lasting. And if certainly you look at the condition of Ethiopia today and in the decades following Live Aid, one can be forgiven for being a little bit cynical about that exercise. It produced a couple of really great songs, and we all felt good together. And a certain amount of money was donated to the cause of alleviating the famine. It didn't change, sort of geopolitics. It didn't change Ethiopia's position in the world. It certainly didn't change the West's attitude towards Africa. USAID ramped up some of its work, but ultimately, I don't, no, I'm not opposed to popular figures rallying the troops for good causes. That's not a bad thing. The problem is that what's really needed is a consciousness raising that isn't based on a popularity contest. It's not based on, where you rank, on the hit parade, okay, on the charts. It's a function or what your record sales are, or, how many people you can turn out at a concert. Taylor Swift didn't succeed in getting America to vote for Kamala Harris. The problem really is that what is necessary is something much deeper and much more difficult than the consciousness raising that comes, momentarily from those types of events. It needs a re-education. It needs a new civics education, because, as I said earlier in our conversation today, the problem is one of social psychology. It's not just a question of which side you're on a particular issue. So America and the West, including Canada, have done a very, very poor job of educating their citizens on the fundamentals of liberal constitutionalism. That's one of the things I focus on in Section 1.
So right? there's not a Winston Churchill.
No, there isn't. And by the way, just on another aspect of your question, you said, well, could anybody change Trump's mind? No, the answer is no on that, positively. Trump's mind can't be changed because it's not the product of rational thinking empirical, empirically based sort of policy analysis, and certainly of morality. It's the product of a certain personal psychology in his particular case, a pathological need to be an autocrat, to be a tyrant and a dictator, and indeed a mafia boss. That's the only thing he understands. It's the only thing he can relate to. And that will not change. And it's not possible in the mind and in the psychology of a Trump to change fundamentally on the issues we've been talking about today. Not possible.
I hope you're wrong.
I would like to be wrong.
I fear you're right. I do think that Bob Geldof, we need people to try to be Bob Geldof. We need people to try to be Winston Churchill. Maybe it's Brian Mulroney and acid rain and apartheid. That's the analogy. I'm not sure what it is, but we can't let what you're saying is going to happen or is happening or has happened as of Friday happen. So we need people like Peter to stand up and be counted. And I think we all need to be standing up and be counting. And I think that Canada's playing a small role in regards to our nationalistic attitudes that have happened since the threatened tariffs against us. I think our Buying Canadian is working. I think our rallying around the I Am Canadian rally that numerous of us have remembered. We need somebody to stand up for the world, and I don't know who that is, but we need to find that person. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure talking with you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. You can get all my podcasts and videos as soon as the radio shows goes to air. I post them on my website, briancrombie.com, on YouTube, on social media, and on several different podcast servers. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you very much.